Great job. Simon is going to go home now and rest his voice. He's, fantastic. We always talk in the church about, getting input on things. And I said to Simon before the service, you've got to be louder, mate. And I've not just seen a great example of, let me put my heart into that. So thank you, Simon, for leading us. And thank you, Shona, for leading us in that song as well. Absolutely great to get some energy into the worship. Now, I'd like to point out that the fire exits are here and here and here, and there are some extended legroom seats available at the front if anybody would like to sit in. These ones have got loads of legroom. Really, just if you feel like you're a bit deep vein thrombosis during the flight, then you can feel free to change seats. Is that okay? I have reconfigured the seats a little bit just to try and improve the audio-visual, and unfortunately, despite spending a long time investigating the latency effects of IP-switched cameras and moving over to NDI, which I Googled and gathered was an awful lot better, so I changed to that, and it was indeed better, and then discovered that the USB 3 interface actually just works perfectly, except today it doesn't. So we have audio and no video today on the stream. So if you are online, I'm sorry about that. You can't see how handsome all the people and beautiful indeed all the people are who are up the front. But the experience is always better live every week. So there we are, video or not. Anyway, let's open our Bibles to Daniel 6. We are still in Daniel. And we're going to look at Daniel in the lion's den today. So, I'm sure we've all sang songs at Sunday school. I'll just find Daniel again. Yes, there it is. Good. So, today I'd like to talk about better to die for conviction than live for a compromise. And that's really what what the story about Daniel tells us. Now, die for a conviction. Now, Marie and I had a conversation about what conviction is. And unfortunately, or fortunately, when you come to a new church, when you come to somewhere you've not been before, you might find, especially if it's a close-knit community like ours, there might be a little bit of jargon involved, a little bit of, you find some words that you've not heard used before. And also, if you study the Bible, that happens as well. I study the Bible with a lot of people, and foreign language speakers usually find some new words that they haven't heard before, but I like to encourage them that even native English speakers find some new words that they've not heard about before when they read the Bible. And it's true. But one of the things we talk about in church is conviction. And it's got a couple of different meanings. So you can have a conviction of something. We can be sure. It's like, if we're really sure about something, then we have the conviction that it's true. Like when you're sent to jail, you get a conviction as well, but that's like a final judgment on what's actually right. And I guess it's similar when we have a conviction that something's true. So what we'll read about in Daniel is that he died for the conviction, or he didn't die. He was willing to die, beg your pardon. I've read the story. He was willing to die for something that he knew to be true. And I think there's a knock-on question or two for us as disciples. So we'll get on and we'll talk a little bit about that. So we can be convicted when somebody calls out our sin, or else we can have a conviction that something is right. So there's kind of two different ways it works there. In the book of Daniel, I'd like to just talk briefly about the first 6 chapters of Daniel. Daniel kind of splits as 12 chapters. The first 6 chapters are of one kind, and the second 6 chapters are of another kind. The second 6 chapters deal with prophecies and dreams and certain things that actually come true. And some of the most accurate prophecies, specific prophecies in the Bible, are in the book of Daniel. But there are some in the first 6 chapters as well. And the first 6 chapters, there's a pattern emerges in each chapter. And it sort of goes like this. A tricky situation arises. Then a man of God rises up to oppose the status quo in front of the watching unbelievers and say, I've got the conviction that this is going to happen, or this is right. And then God does something miraculous to back up that man of God. And then fourthly, what happens is that the king of the time, and there are 3 mentioned in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, the king of the time admits that God of the Bible is powerful and to be praised. And that's maybe the thing that we should come away with for each of these chapters as well. So I'll show you how it works. In chapter 1, very briefly, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are taken off to Babylon, and they're required to eat certain pagan food, unclean food that would be not kosher to a Jew. Daniel refuses to do this and makes an appeal and says, I'll just eat vegetables and see how it goes. And this leaves room for God to work. And then these men are deemed healthier than the other ones who have eaten the palace food. And after 10 days, Nebuchadnezzar interviews them and finds none equal to them. So he turns round to their idea. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he makes threats to his magicians who can't interpret the dream. Then Daniel asks for time, he prays, and God gives him the interpretation. There's the miracle that happens there. And Nebuchadnezzar falls face down and says, wow, this is amazing. I've just met God. We did chapter 3 last week. Nebuchadnezzar sets up a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and he requires everybody to worship it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse, and then God rescues them from the fiery furnace, even though it's 7 times hotter, and then it destroys those who worshipped the gods, the false gods as well. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream, a troubling dream, and Daniel interprets it, and Nebuchadnezzar ends up feeding on grass like cattle. He comes back, he praises God, but this is the last that we hear of Nebuchadnezzar. Presumably he's quite stubborn, he's taken away, his kingdom's taken away. Then in chapter 5 we meet another king called Belshazzar. That's not Belteshazzar, that's Daniel's Babylonian name, but King Belshazzar. And he has a dream and Daniel interprets it. And there's no challenge for Daniel's safety except that he's got to pronounce a firm judgment on the king. Oh yeah, that's a threat to safety, isn't it? Saying what your conviction is against the king. That's not going to work very well. But Daniel doesn't shrink back, and despite that judgment, King Belshazzar makes him the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. And that's the last we hear of him. But then picking up in Daniel 6 is what we're going to look at today. This is a different king. This is Darius, and he also represents a different empire, the Median Empire. And he's very happy with Daniel as administrator. Daniel was likely to be over 80 by this time. I don't know what's happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're not mentioned in this chapter. But maybe Daniel's just outlived them. I don't know. But Darius doesn't protect him and is strong-armed into throwing him to the lions. So let's read it. It's in Daniel 6. And I want to read verses 1 to 10. So it goes like this. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. The administrators and satraps, therefore, trying to find the charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God." So the administrators and satraps went to gather the king and said to him, "May King Darius live forever. All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that, as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed." So King Darius signed the written edict. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room opened towards Jerusalem, and 3 times he got down on his knees and prayed and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. And we'll stop just there. So, Daniel has an extraordinary spirit, we're told. Now, he's set aside as one of the special people of the Bible, I guess, special men of God or women of God that are in the Bible. Now, nobody's perfect. We know that Adam and Eve were perfect before the fall. We know that Jesus was perfect throughout his life. But apart from that, we don't think anybody in the Bible is perfect. Romans 3 says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But Daniel, he was extraordinary. And pretty difficult to trap, according to verse 5. You know, these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God." So, what I wanted just to think about just now is my first point. Walking with God protects us. Walking with God protects us. So, sometimes people say, oh, Christians, you know, they're very limited in what they can do in their lives. They're not really all that free. To which Timothy Keller said, is a goldfish more free in its bowl or out of its bowl? Obviously, goldfish is meant to live in water, so it's more protected when it actually lives in water. Christians are meant to live in harmony with God. Yeah. And if we do that, then we're more protected and actually freer. Yeah. Strangely. But we definitely are. Now, Daniel might have been tempted in all sorts of ways to live outside the goldfish bowl. How might he be tempted as administrator of a kingdom? You know, anybody who's got any responsibility in the world might understand how it's possible for Daniel to be tempted. He might be tempted to tell lies to improve his position, to show that he's done a better job than he has, telling lies to make his report look better, perhaps. Or using his position to gain comfort for himself. Anybody in any position of authority can do that, and that can be dangerous. Or showing favoritism to some to look for favours later on. Or perhaps enjoy advances from impressionable women who would make him feel good about himself. Daniel could have been tempted by a lot of different things as administrator of the kingdom. But all of those things make us feel powerful now, but create mess for us later, and that's why the Bible says that we have to be beyond reproach. God protects us too, and God has some strong views on things. Think about God's stance on sexual morality. One man, one woman, married for life. You know, God has blessed me through obeying that stance on sexual morality. Marie and I have to be selfless in our lives, but He's given us a great marriage. But it gets better. You know, I have a trusted companion to walk with through life, until one of us dies. And that doesn't mean we don't have conflict, but we have the Bible, and we have discipling, and we have ways to resolve that conflict. And, you know, Jesus and prayer and other disciples can really help us to repentance. You know, those who indulge in selfish pleasure before making a commitment end up lonely and wondering why it didn't work out. Yeah. And is right for sexual morality. What about forgiveness? When we don't forgive, we're the losers. Yeah. Some people can't get into their heads, you know, but we can forgive and we can let God do the judging. We've got a God of grace, as Gould talked about, but we also have a God of judgment as well. And God is fully a God of grace and fully a God of judgment. And that's a bit hard to get our heads around, but it's true. But because God is a God of judgment, we can forgive and let God avenge later. Makes it easy. But somebody said that unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting somebody else to die. You know, because when we don't forgive somebody, the main person who's angry is us, is the one who doesn't forgive. Yeah. So God's commands about righteousness, about forgiveness, are correct. Because unforgiveness destroys relationships. What about the commission to share the gospel? Jesus says that, you know, go and make disciples of all nations, like the Great Commission, sometimes it's called. Seems like hard work. But it teaches us where we fall short. It helps us to realise, actually, I was sharing my faith yesterday in Glasgow, and I ended up on my own, and it's humbling. You know, when people, it's challenging to go up to people and talk to them and get into deep conversations with them. It's humbling. But actually, us sharing the gospel with people helps us to grow in our conviction, that word again. It helps us to understand more how much we've been saved from. It helps me understand just where people's lives are at, and that helps us to grow closer to God. So again, God's plans helping us, protecting us, obeying the law of the land. You know, we've got to obey the law of the land. That's, what we see in our generation is a breakdown of social contract. Social contract is a thing where I obey the law because I know it protects me. But you see, people don't obey the law. When they think they can get away with it, they don't obey the law. You look at the number of people going around on electric scooters that aren't legal, smoking cannabis in the street, that sort of thing, avoiding tax, software piracy, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to get caught, so I'm just going to do it anyway. Yeah. No, you will get caught later by the judgment of the God that does judge. Daniel knew that God would protect him, whatever happened. He didn't change his regime. He didn't pray more for show when there was a command not to pray. He didn't pray less. He just kept on going. I mean, the command was only for 30 days. Verse 7 tells us that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man other than you, Nebuchadnezzar, Darius we're talking about this time, Darius, will be thrown into the lion's den. And Daniel could quite easily have said, well, just 30 days, what's 30 days? I'll just not pray to God for 30 days and that'll be fine. Or I'll just pray quietly for 30 days. No, he actually stood up for what was right. Yeah. He prayed. Yeah. How is our prayer life? It was great. We took the men's meeting up to the Catholic Embrace on Wednesday, and we, lit a little campfire and we prayed. But I think we could have been so much more zealous in our prayer, and I think we can. How is our prayer life? It says Daniel got on his knees to pray. When did you last get on your knees to pray? I can't sit on my knees for all that long. I'm getting older, but I got on my knees this week and prayed because I haven't done it for a long time. Or fast. When did we last fast? How many times a day do we pray? Daniel was actually he was going on what Solomon said in 1 Kings 30. After Solomon dedicates the temple, he said to anybody who prays towards this temple, may you hear and forgive sins. So Daniel was just praying towards the temple in Jerusalem because that was the way Solomon dedicated the temple, and he knew that he would be heard and have his sins forgiven. Our sins are forgiven. If we repented and we're cut to the heart, do we give thanks for that? Are our prayers thankful? Are they of praise? Do they lift up God, or do they just lift up the difficulties in our lives? How are our prayers for the people of Glasgow? Do we actually pray for the lost people of this city? This is a very lost city. There's so much mess goes on in people's lives. I think the novel I'm reading just now, based in Glasgow, and the mess that just goes on. And I think I need to read stuff like this because I need to understand and to connect with that. But I need to get out there and study the Bible with people as well to help them and understand what's really going on there too. Do our prayers convict us to reach out to other people? And do our prayers of praise give us joy? I'll just leave that question with you. My second point, was this a mistake? Did Darius make a mistake? Let's read on. Let's read on in verse 11 through to 18. It says, then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. I think they knew that's what he was going to do anyway. I think they knew where to find him because he was doing it every day anyway, 3 times a day. So, verse 12, they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict? Didn't you? I think we asked you to do that. That for 30 days any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. The king answered, as a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. Then these men went together to the king and said to him, you know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. Wow. The king clearly didn't want to mete out the punishment that his nobles had set up for Daniel, but he was backed into a corner. He was kind of strong-armed into doing this. He didn't need to do it. Had he made a mistake? I think he thought he'd made a mistake at this time. A pretty big mistake. Daniel was going to get thrown into the lion's den. And then we're told that the king didn't sleep that night. He spent the night fasting or not eating. No diversions were brought in. Presumably of an evening the king would have had plenty of food and plenty of entertainment. This didn't happen that particular night. What was Daniel doing? I wonder how he was getting on with the lions. Was he cowering in a corner, or was he enjoying and rejoicing in God that he had these big pet lions to play with that night who weren't going to eat him? Clearly had no intent on eating him at all. Who slept better that night? Was it the king or was it Daniel? Might well have been Daniel in the lion's den, enjoying time with God's creatures. They're amazing creatures, actually. You see them in the zoo, but I do like them with a bit of glass in between me, or a cage or something, or the safari park where you can go in your car. Fantastic creatures, but actually under control of God. Our foolish decisions can often haunt us, and I think the king's decision haunted him as well. Darius knew he'd made a mistake, and this is a kind of turning point in the passage here. The wise man said, to be disappointed in yourself is to have trusted yourself. How often are we disappointed in ourselves? I think I'm a bit disappointed in myself for not being able to get the tech stuff working today. But then, was I relying on myself, or was I relying on God? I feel like I was trying to rely on God, but I'm disappointed I'm not able to get that working properly. But do we rely on ourselves, or do we rely on God? Because if we rely on God, then we'll not be disappointed. We'll just say, this is a challenge, a bit like Goldie read in James. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds. And we can just say, well, this is on God. And this is a trial that we can have, and we can rejoice through it. Another time I was disappointed in myself was when I was on the bus. This was one of Marie's and my wedding anniversaries. And I was on a bus bound for Paris-Beauvais Airport, because that's how you get there from the centre of Paris. And we'd been told to be at the bus stop 3 hours before the flight went. And I was trusting myself. And I said, I thought, that's a bit early. Don't really need to be there 3 hours before. Only you did. And the reason you did, discovered later on, was that there's only one bus that goes to meet each plane, and it leaves 3 hours before. So if you're very lucky, and we were, there's another bus going to meet a slightly later flight that you can get on if you arrive within 3 hours of your flight. The only trouble is that flight was going quite a lot later than ours, and it was going to be really tight for us getting on our plane. Now, we were very, very lucky, and we ended up, our plane was late, because had it left on time, we would have missed it. We were actually halfway up the Eiffel Tower 3 hours before our flight was due. It was great. We had a great time and everything. But, I trusted myself. If we trust in ourselves, we're going to lose. If we trust in God like Daniel, no, God will come through for us. That's just what happens when we trust our own judgment. But Daniel's a loyal servant, and he knows that it's riskier to disobey God than to disobey man. Do we know that? Do we know that? I'll say that again. Do we know that in our hearts, that it's riskier to disobey God than it is to disobey man? Or to put it another way, what would be enough to make you stop following Jesus? What would be enough to make you stop seeking God? Now, it's easy to say, oh, nothing would. That would be, But what could you be tempted to do that would draw you further away from God? Like I say, this edict was only for 30 days. He could have said, oh, that's fine. I'll just keep quiet for 30 days. I'll just miss church a few times. I'll just not have quiet times for a wee bit. That'll be okay. Job says in Job chapter 13, verse 15, Job says, though he slay me, I will trust him. And that was Daniel's attitude as well. Even though I'm going to go to my death, I'm going to trust God. Maybe somebody said something unhelpful to you and you feel like disconnecting for a bit. No, Daniel's life was at risk. Maybe you felt like there was a chance of a romantic relationship with a non-Christian, so I'll disconnect from church for a bit. Daniel's life was at risk. He wouldn't do that. I think back to a time when I used to work for a big multinational company, and I was on a business trip. I was in Europe on a business trip, and I was the only person going from my office. I was in Germany, and a colleague approached me. I realised that she'd arrived from the Dublin office. Young, attractive female colleague of the same company, but working in a different office. And she said to me, "Why don't we go out for dinner together?" And I know that in the business environment, it's normal for people travelling on business to dine together because it's a bit lonely when you're travelling for work. But I declined, and I don't actually remember what I said, but I just thought, I had conviction that I just don't want to be alone with an attractive woman who's not a disciple in case I'm tempted. And I hope I wasn't too rude to her, but I said, no, I don't. Now, rights and wrongs of that, don't know, but there was a conviction there. There was a conviction of trying to do the right thing. Do we try and do the right thing to protect our consciences and to protect our hearts?
Yeah, that's right.
What else could go wrong? Are we struggling with our evangelism and what makes us want to disconnect from God? Daniel's life was at risk. Have we got financial worries? And we maybe think that if we disconnected a bit, we could sort that out ourselves. No. Daniel had so much going on in his life, and he still did the right thing. See, in each of the chapters of Daniel, as we talked about, there's a contention that God fixes. And Daniel knew it was better to die for a conviction, that is, a strongly held belief, than live for a compromise. Do you have that conviction? Point 3, redemption and glorification. Let's read 19 to the end. Verse 19 of Daniel 6. At the first light of dawn, when the king got up and hurried to the lion's den, when he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God." Notice the way he addresses Daniel there. The king said, "Has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke with the king. "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me. For I was found innocent before him and before you, Your Majesty. I have not done harm." The king was overjoyed, and when he gave orders to take Daniel out of the den, When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. Then the king gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den, they, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Wow. You know, the lions were not asleep, they were not drugged, they were perfectly functional, real, ferocious lions. And God had done a miracle to protect Daniel from them. Why had he done a miracle? Because Daniel obeyed and Daniel loved God. And Daniel knew that it was better to die for a conviction than to live for a compromise.
Amen.
Do we have that thought as well? Read from 25 as well, because this is the praise that Daniel offers to God. So then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation and language who live on the whole earth, "May your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion people must tremble in fear because of the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. For he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian.